Now, students, what we're going to do is to turn our attention to Book 2, Chapter 6. And we are going to return again to the idea of rules and scientific exactitude in ethics. And we'll start off again with the definition of virtue. Remember, we'd said previously that virtue is activity of the soul in accordance with reason. Now, Aristotle delivers what, and this probably is his most famous quotation from our text. He says that virtue is a state of deliberative moral purpose, aiming at the mean, following reason, or following the man of prudence. Well, oh my gosh, this seems to be a little bit different definition, doesn't it? But when we look at it more closely, it fits hand in glove with what we've said before. Virtue is a state of deliberative moral purpose. What does that mean? To deliberate means to think, to use our active rationality, to think it through with a moral purpose. We're trying to do the good. Virtue has to be aimed at the good. And what is that good? It's the mean that we're aiming at. And we're aiming at that mean in accordance with reason. In other words, using our rationality and not our emotions or our instincts. We're going to use our minds to our greatest advantage. And if reason cannot tell us what to do, then we ask, what would the man of prudence do? This is where that new element seems to creep in. All of a sudden, he's talking about the prudent man. That's something of a difficulty because in 21st century English, we almost never talk about prudence. And when we use the word prudence, we usually use it in the form prude, and it usually has a negative connotation. To call someone a prude is generally not a compliment. So what's he saying? Let's back up for a second and ask, what is prudence? Prudence is caution. Prudence is the virtue of caution. So if we call somebody a prude, what we really mean is they're cautious and we think that being risky is better. In other words, it's a put down by people who live in extremes of somebody who's erring on the side of caution. Aristotle is saying, if rationality points out the mean, follow that mean, aim at that mean. If it's not clear what the rational procedure is, then err on the side of caution. How did he come up with that? Again, he's going to say, it's an empirical observation, and if I'm wrong about this, correct me and I'll follow you. But when we look at the way that the world works, people who are cautious will generally tend to survive a risky situation better than people who fly off the handle and act in an extreme fashion. Aristotle is saying, when we don't know exactly which way to go, err on the side of caution, be more cautious. Virtue is the greatest excellence. It is what we're all trying to aim at, to be virtuous, to have a lot of virtues, to have a bundle of virtues in our character is going to make us happy. It is going to lead us to the happy life. always being extreme, flying off the handle, running risks, doing outrageous things will cause us to fail, cause us to lead unhappy lives. So we need to pursue virtue. But not every action or every emotion has a mean to it. That would be easy if every emotion had an obvious moderation point. It'd be easy to aim at it. Or if every activity had a clear moderation to it, that would make things very easy. The problem is that in some activities there is no mean whatsoever. Take, for example, well, two examples that Aristotle uses are murder and adultery. Take murder. He's not saying, well, don't murder too little and don't murder too much. Murder in the right amount. He's not saying that at all. He's saying there is no moderate point for murder. Any murder is extreme. Likewise, adultery. He's not saying, well, don't commit adultery too little, don't commit adultery too much, commit just the right amount of adultery. Any amount of adultery is wrong because that activity does not allow for any kind of moderation whatsoever. It is always incautious. It is always extreme. It is never going to be a habit that makes good citizens for the polis. But having said that, now if you're paying attention, you see a certain contradiction because he's saying virtue is the disposition to aim at moderation, and yet some activities and some emotions have no moderation. So what am I supposed to aim at, Aristotle? At this point, the previous observation that he had made, that ethics has no absolute rules, will kick in. There is no absolute rule that you can name. Moderation, even, is not an absolute rule. The doctrine of the mean, this is what we call it, the doctrine of the mean, the idea that you should aim at moderation, that's not always true. It's true most of the time, but it's not always true. What that means is there are no absolute rules in ethics. And so to develop a theory based on a lot of absolute rules, not even a possibility. What we have to do instead is to work on practice and make as many people virtuous in their practice as possible. That generally is going to be aiming at moderation, but in some activities it's going to mean avoiding them altogether. There's just no moderate point to them. Okay, so let's go back to my chain of inference that I've previously developed. Aristotle wants us to lead the moral life. The moral life is the good life. The good life is the happy life. The happy life is the life of virtue. The life of virtue is the rational life. The rational life is the life of aiming at moderation. And aiming at moderation is going to be an art or science that we cannot teach in terms of absolute rules. So it's going to be a life of inexactitude, but a life of moral purpose where we deliberate to try and find the right amount. Now, there are no selections from Book 2, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics in our textbook. That then leads us to Book 2, Chapter 8. Here now, he continues the main theme of Book 2, which is virtue, and we've gone through the difference between intellectual and moral virtues. We've gone through the side constraints for virtues. We have brought it back to unique function. What we want to do now, for the first time in the book, is to consider some particular virtues. In Book 2, Chapter 8, Aristotle considers 3 virtues, specific virtues. These are not the only 3. In fact, in the entire remainder of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is 10 books, and we're only looking at 2 of them, parts of 2 of the books, and the rest of the 8 books that follow these, Aristotle lays out the individual virtues and what they're like. So if this seems to be too schematic or too partial, there's a lot more to follow that you can research. In Book 2, Chapter 8, he's going to consider bravery, temperance, and what he calls liberality. Before he begins that, though, he returns, again, his literary style of the reprise. He makes a reprise back to this notion of the middle point, the mean. And he reminds us that a mean is a point between a deficiency and an excess. In other words, between too little and too much. It's the golden zone between too little and too much. The mean is between a deficiency and an excess. And virtue will always be connected or identified to the middle point, the mean, and the deficiency and excess will always be identified as vices, and equal vices at that. Too little is no better or no worse than too much of something. Okay, let's apply those ideas now to the first specific virtue that he wants to talk about, and that's bravery. Now, bravery is going to be a mean between 2 extremes. Those extremes are going to be a deficiency and an excess. Of what? He's going to take the essence of bravery to be confronting a potentially deadly situation. If we do that too little, the deficiency, the vice, is going to be called cowardice. If, on the other hand, we confront deadly situations too much or too thoughtlessly, that is going to be an excess, and that vice is going to be called foolhardiness. So think about 3 radically different men. One's a coward, one's foolhardy, and in between them is the brave man. Aristotle spends a lot of time talking about bravery in the rest of the book and in his other books because he lives in a military society. He lives in a warrior culture where bravery is one of the 4 cardinal virtues. Not all virtues are equal. One of the top 4 virtues is bravery, and he has a really specific essence that he connects to bravery. It is seeing the potential of losing your life, facing a potentially deadly situation where you form the thought, I could die. Now, the brave man will confront that challenge and consider the values of confronting it or not. Aristotle takes, in virtually every situation, the scenario of battle, where I march up as part of an army, I see a potentially deadly situation where I could lose my life. The value that is motivating me is defense of the city-state. That's the value. The value is so great, the value of the city-state is so great, that what the brave man does is to say, I'm scared, but I'm going to go into battle anyway. Bravery is not an absence of fear. Aristotle gets this from Plato and Socrates, both of whom were soldiers. In fact, Socrates was the greatest living war hero of his time, but Plato was also a soldier. Aristotle was a soldier and an officer. They know bravery is not a lack of fear. Bravery is the presence of fear. But it's balancing fear and value and facing the fear. He says, you're not truly brave unless you believe that you are going to die. So I'm a soldier in a phalanx, a line of infantry. I see I could die. The value is I'm going to protect my city-state. So even though I'm afraid, I march forward. Now I'm brave. This man over here, he sees the same situation. He forms the same thought, I could die. He's got the same value. He's defending the city-state, but what has greater weight for him is the fear. So he turns around and runs. He does not confront the enemy. He turns around and runs. He's the coward. What about the foolhardy man? The foolhardy man also sees the dangerous situation, forms the thought, I could die. And what he does, instead of following orders, maintaining discipline, he runs out and attacks the enemy in a foolhardy, risky fashion to try and show off. He's likely to get hurt, and then what will happen? His comrades will have to go and retrieve him and risk their lives. So he's got an excess of bravery. Put it another way, he does not calculate the fear strongly enough. So he's decided he's Superman. He's just going to run and be super soldier. But he's a fool to do that. The proper thing, stay in line, follow orders. That's the proper thing to do for Aristotle. So the virtue is the point of moderation between coward and foolhardiness. Now let's take temperance. This is really a can of worms, students, because you and I, in 21st century English, we almost never talk about temperance. And so we don't have a clue what he's talking about here. And yet we can make a connection. There was a historical movement in the United States called the temperance movement. Do you know what that was? It was for prohibition against alcohol. Temperance meant to abstain from alcohol. Why was temperance used, that term temperance, why was it used in that connection? Because temperance is always going to involve matters of consumption, things that we consume or involve ourselves in. In the Greek, it's sophrosune. That's an almost impossible Greek word to translate. It roughly, and I mean very roughly, means self-control. But if we take that notion of self-control and apply it to matters of consumption, then we get some insight. Temperance is the virtue of consuming the right amount of a substance or an activity. Okay, so let's take the example of alcohol. To be temperate would mean to drink the proper amount of alcohol in your lifestyle or diet, however you want to put it. Not too little, not too much. It's a matter of enjoyment for the Greeks. Sophrosune, self-control, means to control yourself in front of pleasure. It's a matter of how you control yourself, how you conduct yourself in matters of pleasure and consumption. Now, if you drink too little alcohol, that's called insensitivity. In other words, you're insensitive or you don't appreciate the value of alcohol in your life. If you drink too much, then that's gluttony. Okay, so you can see how this also applies to food. The Greeks also used sophrosune to apply to food. If you don't get pleasure out of consuming good food, you're just indifferent to it, then you're insensitive. If, on the other hand, you'll eat anything that somebody puts in front of you and you try and eat just as much of it as you humanly can, you're a glutton. Okay, we're familiar with that term. Now, for sophrosune among the Greeks, the three things that they thought of was drink and food, which I've considered, and the third one is sex. So the temperate person, to the Greek, the sophrosune virtue is to indulge in the proper amount of sex in your life. Not too little, not too much. If you're insensitive to sexuality, you don't appreciate it. If you are licentious, if you're a glutton for sex, then you take every opportunity, regardless of who it's with or the quality. It's just all sex is good. Okay, so Aristotle is going to say not too little, not too much in terms of enjoyment of substances. Be temperate. It's going to be a point between the two extremes, both of which are equal vices. Finally, this virtue that he calls liberality, and my gosh, what a hot button word that is, liberal or liberalism or liberality. Let's maybe use the synonym here, generosity. Here the Greek is going to be real specific. It is going to be pertaining to giving money to people in need. We could think of it maybe as charity, although that's maybe not the best synonym, but generosity is a good synonym for it. For Aristotle, if you're not generous enough, that is the vice of stinginess, and that's very much part of our English vocabulary. We use the word stingy a great deal. And if you are too generous, then that is the vice of extravagance. You're being extravagant in your giving money to those in need. You don't want to give too little. You don't want to give too much. You want to give the right amount of financial aid to those who are in need. If you haven't noticed this yet, it is sort of the Goldilocks principle, isn't it? Not too little, not too much, just right. It is a sort of Goldilocks principle. It doesn't make it any easier, but he's certainly saying aim at moderation. So we don't want to be stingy, we don't want to be extravagant, we want to have an art or a science that gives us a disposition, a habit or a tendency where we can see the right amount to give at the right time, to the right person, in the right way, for the right reason, with the right consequences. That is going to be liberality or generosity as a virtue. Okay, so we've worked through those examples. Now, isn't it clear that different people at different points in their lives will have different points of moderation? That's definitely right, and Aristotle sees that. The amount that I can give to those in need will vary over my life. When I'm young and I'm hardly making any money at all, I can't spend very much money. I could still be generous, but the amount of money that I'm giving will probably be a lot less than later in life, when I've got a solid career and my retirement is all set up and I've got some extra money that I don't know what to do with. Now I can spend more. Late in life, when I am in retirement, have no income, and I have to choose between medicine and food, now the amount that I can spend changes again. Oh my gosh, so it changes. Yes, absolutely. What is the criticism there? Aristotle sees very realistically that the mean, moderation, is going to change. And so if I am a virtuous person, I have to be able to detect the movement in the point of moderation. I have to be able to be flexible and change. Isn't that true in life? Aristotle has built it into his model. Life is long. There's a lot of changes. Life throws a lot of things at you. And so what it means to be moderate, what it means to be rational, what it means to be virtuous is a subtle art or science. It requires refinement, good judgment, and a kind of sophistication and knowledge that you build up over a long period of time. He sees that completely. But that's the challenge of life, and that's going back to the life skills. The skill of leading a good life means being able to change and adapt, as well as being strong and consistent. And that's not an easy challenge, but nobody said life was going to be easy. So Aristotle sees that the person of rationality is going to make subtle changes, alterations, and adjustments in their aiming at the bullseye. Isn't it clear as well that the mean, the middle point, is not geometric, it's not absolute, it's not the exact point spatially or geometrically between the two extremes? Going back to the three specific virtues, he says the mean is oftentimes going to be closer to one extreme than the other. Let's take bravery. bravery is closer to foolhardiness than it is to cowardice. Why? Because the brave man and the foolhardy man have something very important in common. They actually face the enemy. They fight the enemy. The coward turns and runs. So the brave man resembles the foolhardy man a lot more than he resembles the coward. What about temperance? The proper amount of consumption. Here we're not talking about lollipops, we're talking about things that can present problems, like alcohol. Is the temperate man closer to somebody who doesn't drink at all, or is he closer to the town drunk? The temperate man is closer to the teetotaler, if I can put it that way, the person who drinks no alcohol, than the town drunk. To drink the proper amount of alcohol means social drinking, having a glass of wine at dinner. It doesn't mean drinking everything that you can get your hands on until you're sloppy drunk and an embarrassment to your family and you wind up dead along the road. So the temperate man is closer to the insensitive person than the licentious person. Finally, generosity. The generous person is closer to the extravagant person than the stingy person, because the stingy person may give no money at all. They're like the coward. They may give no money at all. The generous person and the extravagant person are spending their money. It's a matter of going overboard for the extravagant person, but they still have that commonality of spending money. So that virtue is closer to the excess than it is the deficiency. There's a final reason why that mean is not simply a geometric proportion, in other words, an absolute mean that we could calculate, like 6 being the mean between 2 and 10. There's another reason why the middle moderation point may be closer to one extreme than the other, and that is subjectively. Each of us are unique people that bring unique personalities, unique histories, unique problems and promises into the mix. Let's go back to alcohol for a minute. Their subjective factors clearly enter in. A person who is an alcoholic, a bad alcoholic, is going to find that their mean amount may be 0, maybe none at all. Whereas other people can have that glass of wine at dinner. Another person subjectively can hold their alcohol. They get no thrill from alcohol. They don't think about alcohol. They've got no genetic predisposition to it. So they can drink a lot more, even get drunk occasionally, and not have it ruin their lives. The subjective factor enters in. Now, oh my gosh, if you see the importance of that, you know that this is deeply profound, what he's saying here. Since there are subjective factors, I have to know myself. Virtue requires self-knowledge. What if I am that bad drunk, but I'm not aware of it? I'm kidding myself. I'm living in denial, saying I can do as much drinking as I want and I'm perfectly okay. I live in denial. I lie to myself. I don't know myself. then I'm in bad trouble. I cannot correct myself and go to abstinence. I cannot correct myself and become virtuous. Self-knowledge is required. Just like if I'm foolhardy, but I don't realize that. I think, well, I'm just a brave man. I'm living in self-ignorance, and I can't correct myself properly to become brave. I will stay foolhardy. So, self-knowledge is absolutely crucial, but it's also extremely rare and hard to obtain. And once you get it, it's hard to keep self-knowledge because the self itself changes over life, over the long course of life. Okay, now, building that in as a final link in my chain of inference, here we go to the grand project of Aristotle. Aristotle wants us to lead the moral life. The moral life is the good life. The good life is the happy life. The happy life is a life of virtue. The life of virtue is the life of active rationality. The life of active rationality is the life of moderation. The life of moderation demands self-knowledge, and therefore we must lead a life of self-knowledge. And that is hard. The Greeks realized this. The Greeks, way before Aristotle, had already realized the hardest thing for us to know is ourselves, because we build mirrors and smoke screens and walls and false images of ourselves. It's hard to know yourself. It's not easy, but that's what's demanded by morality, and it's why most people fail and most people don't lead happy lives. It's all in vain because they don't know themselves. That ends Book 2, Chapter 8.